When it comes to the Japanese cruiser Chokai, there is quite a bit of misinformation, not from any real intent to lie about her fate, only from a lack of concrete information on how she sank. It wouldn't be until 2019 that a long-enduring story about her sinking was proven wrong, and that took finding her wreck to figure out. In this video, I'll cover Chokai's history from her launch until the discovery of her wreck, and go over exactly why this video has the title it does. First, as is tradition, the technical details. Chokai was the fourth of the Takao-class cruisers. Ostensibly designed to the Washington Treaty limits, this class was overweight from the word go. Their standard displacement was around 11,500 tons. This rose as high as 15,500 tons on the full loading. Much of this weight came from their massive superstructure, along with various other parts coming in overweight. That bridge tower is arguably the most recognizable part of these ships. It's a design choice that sticks out, and you either love it or hate it. On the first two ships, this was slimmed down in a later refit. Chokai would have the original design for her entire career. The end result was a design that was top-heavy, with a low freeboard and unstable in rough weather. Fairly typical of interwar Japanese design in that regard. Now, what about her firepower? That was 10 20-centimeter, 8-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. These were all mounted on the center line, with 3 ahead of the bridge and a super-firing pair on the stern. The 3 ahead of the bridge were carried in a distinctive layout. The number 1 turret on a low level, followed by the number 2 turret super-firing over it, and then the number 3 turret just ahead of the bridge on the same level as the first one. As for the remaining weaponry, that consisted of 4 12-centimeter, 4.7-inch dual-purpose guns, and 8 torpedo tubes carried in the central superstructure. 2 twin mounts on either side of the ship, beneath the bridge and between the funnels. The weaponry would change drastically over the career of these ships, mostly in being stuffed full of 25mm anti-aircraft guns. On the other members of the class, their 12-centimeter guns were also replaced by 12.7-centimeter weapons. Chokai, meanwhile, retained the older guns right up to her sinking. To wrap up this section, however, armor protection consisted of a main belt of 102mm. This thickened to 127mm, 5 inches, over the magazines. All of this could reach around 34 to 35 knots on 132,000 shaft horsepower. This is also typically Japanese in the quest for more speed on their cruisers. That does finish the techie bits, so it's time to move on to the service history. The ship that became Chokai was laid down on March 26, 1928, in Nagasaki. She would launch a little over 3 years later, on April 5th of 1931. Her commissioning followed on June 30th, 1932. All fairly average to this point, and that would be true of her early service career as well. The 1930s followed the usual theme with Japanese warships of a lot of patrols, training, and refits. Chokai, in particular, spent most of her time patrolling off the Chinese coast, both before and after war broke out between the two countries. None of these patrols led to any combat, however, as the Chinese fleet was, well, what they had was quickly knocked out by other means. Instead, the most exciting things for Chokai during the 30s were her refits, minor as those were, and hosting the Emperor for a fleet review in 1933. As it is, it took until the 1940s, specifically 1941, for things to get exciting. If you've watched my Mogami class videos, a lot of this next bit is going to be familiar. Chokai joined with the Mogamis as part of Japan's southern thrust towards Malaya. She set sail for this assault on December 4th, 1941. It wouldn't take long for potential excitement to come to Chokai. On December 9th, 1941, the British Force Z was sighted by the submarine I-65. This formation had set sail to try and contest Japanese landings, unaware of exactly how large this operation really was. The British formation, consisting of Prince of Wales, Repulse, and some destroyers, was a prime target for the Japanese. I've gone over this before in other videos, but the idea of a night battle between the two masters of that technique would have been a sight to see here. Prince of Wales and Repulse against Congo, Haruna, and their escorts. Although it wasn't meant to be, Force Z would turn around and escape any attempts by the Japanese fleet to bring them to battle. The British capital ships would, instead, be sunk by air power on December 10th. This is all something I've covered before. There is, however, something I haven't mentioned because it directly involves Chokai. On the night of December 9th, while hunting for the British formation, a Japanese scout aircraft spotted Chokai. This scout mistook her for one of the British ships and made a sighting report to that effect. This led to 53 Japanese bombers coming in to attack. Luckily for Chokai, she was recognized as friendly before being subjected to a massive air attack. A flare had illuminated her, and someone in the planes recognized her design. Would have been rather unfortunate for the Japanese to begin the war by sinking one of their own heavy cruisers. In the event, Chokai wasn't bombed, and she went about her business. The cruiser escorted convoys and provided shore bombardment in support of landings. Fairly routine and quiet duty, as Chokai missed the big sea battles of the Java Sea campaign. That said, on February 22nd, she ran aground on a reef. That damage required her to dock at the recently captured Singapore for repairs that would keep her in dock until March 9th. Following the repairs, though, the cruiser joined the Mogami class once more. First for more convoy escorts and fire support missions. Then for something rather more interesting in the Indian Ocean raid. That took place in early April of 1942. It would see the Japanese rampage through the Indian Ocean, striking Ceylon and sinking multiple British warships and merchants. Chokai's role, in particular, came on April 6th. She would support the aircraft carrier Ryujo in sinking 5 merchant ships, 2 American freighters, 2 British cargo ships, and 1 Dutch freighter, although that last one actually sank 2 days later. This saw aircraft from both Chokai and the carrier attack the freighters, while 3 of them were finished off by surface gunfire. All told, it added up to around 22,300 tons of shipping. However, the remainder of the Indian Ocean raid would see little in the way of action for Chokai. By April 11th, 1942, she was back in Singapore. By the 13th, she set sail to return to Japan, arriving there on April 22nd. While in Japan, Chokai received a minor refit and overhaul. This was largely focused on routine maintenance, but it also saw her begin to pick up the 25mm morale boosters so common to Japanese warships. Not that she'd put those to use, at least not yet. Upon finishing her refit on May 9th, 1942, Chokai remained in Japanese waters. She was assigned to the invasion of Midway as part of the support force. This would mean that she missed the actual Battle of Midway, as it turned out. While the Kido Butai was ravaged on June 4th, Chokai went undamaged. As a direct result, she would return home on June 14th without ever engaging the American fleet. From June through August 1942, the cruiser had little to write home about. She remained in Japan until July, before sailing to the Solomon Islands. This would, similarly, see no action at first. It wouldn't be until August 7th, in response to the American invasion of Guadalcanal, that Chokai sailed against her enemy once again. That would lead directly into one of 3 major battles in her career. On August 9th, she was the flagship at the Battle of Savo Island. This saw her lead a Japanese cruiser formation against an Allied formation protecting the landings on Guadalcanal. It was as close to a turkey shoot as any cruiser engagement could get. Chokai and her consorts ravaged the Allied formation. They crippled HMAS Canberra, damaged USS Chicago, and ended up sinking 3 New Orleans-class cruisers in one battle. Those 3 cruisers, USS Astoria, USS Vincennes, and USS Quincy, were caught unawares. The crossfire they endured wrecked all 3, sinking 2 outright, and leaving Astoria a blazing ruin that sank the next day. Chokai distinguished herself during this with accurate gunfire and good use of her torpedoes. Her crew was one of the best in the Japanese Navy. This was not without cost, however. Chokai was hit several times by the Allied cruisers, most likely Quincy and Astoria. This knocked out her number 1 turret and killed 34 of her crew. Considering the burning cruisers she left in her wake, this probably served as little comfort for the Americans. After emergency repairs, Chokai would spend the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign on various convoy runs, as well as bombarding Henderson Field. She would not, however, engage Allied surface forces. Chokai only suffered minor damage, and that was from air attack, such as on November 14th, 2 near misses from Enterprise dive bombers. This flooded some of her compartments and disabled 2 boiler rooms. Chokai kept right on at about 29 knots, heading to safety for repairs. She arrived at Truk Lagoon for those repairs on November 20th, 1942. Upon the conclusion of the repairs on December 1st, the cruiser returned to the Solomons for a couple months. She saw no further action before leaving in early February 1943. By this point, the Guadalcanal campaign was over in Japanese defeat. Instead of keeping Chokai around, she returned home, arriving in Japan on February 20th, for another refit that lasted until March 13th. When that refit was done, the cruiser entered into another quiet period in her life. Most of 1943 was spent on secondary duties, with the odd sortie in response to American carrier raids or invasions. After rounding out 1943 back in Truk Lagoon in December, Chokai left the Japanese base on February 10th, 1944. She would avoid the massive American attacks on the 17th and 18th as a result. The rest of 1944 would, for the most part, follow the same pattern as 1943. Chokai largely avoided combat, relegated to escorting convoys and training duty. There would only be 2 notable exceptions to this rule. First, on June 20th of 1944, came the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Chokai came out of this undamaged once more, as the Japanese carrier force was ravaged once again. The second major battle would not prove so fortunate. After some more time on secondary roles and refits, Chokai was assigned to the center force for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This assignment came in late October of 1944. Chokai set sail with the rest of the center force on October 22nd, 1944. Things almost immediately went wrong. USS Darter and USS Dace attacked the Japanese on October 23rd. This saw 2 of Chokai's sisters, Atago and Maya, sent to the bottom, and her third sister, Takao, damaged and forced to withdraw. Chokai's luck continued to hold out as she avoided any hits. The same would hold true the next day as a massive air attack descended on the Japanese. Hundreds of American aircraft attacked the center force, damaging the battleships and outright sinking Musashi. 2 of the cruisers, Miyoko and Tone, were also hit. Chokai was, once again, undamaged. Her luck would end up running out, however, on October 25th. Chokai joined the rest of the center force in the battle off Samar. The Japanese engaged Taffy 3, a massively outgunned formation of American light forces. Escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts. This story is a familiar one, so I'll focus on Chokai. Around 8:50 in the morning, the cruiser came under American fire. This was 5-inch shell fire from the escorting destroyers and destroyer escorts, probably including Samuel B. Roberts herself. Where things get problematic is the off-sided claim that USS White Plains detonated Chokai's torpedoes. While White Plains might have landed hits on Chokai, even this is debated, she certainly didn't blow up any torpedoes. A massive explosion did occur on Chokai, but if this was the result of shell fire or air attack is also debatable. What isn't debatable is an Avenger landing a 500-pound bomb to Chokai's machinery spaces. This further crippled the cruiser, leaving her vulnerable to more attacks. Ultimately, the burning cruiser lurched out of formation and drifted to a halt. She would eventually be scuttled by the destroyer Fujinami, which picked up the survivors of her crew, only to, in turn, be sunk 2 days later with all hands, including Chokai's surviving crew. That is partially responsible for the misconceptions about her sinking. Misconceptions that would last from October 25th, 1944, right up until May 30th, 2019. On that day, RV Petrel dove Chokai's wreck. They put special focus on her torpedo tubes for obvious reasons, and these were found to be intact. All 4 sets remained in place, rusting aside. Even the torpedo storage areas were mostly intact, with only minimal damage. Certainly there was no evidence of torpedoes blowing up. Whatever happened to Chokai on that October morning, it wasn't her own torpedoes crippling her. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.